Thanks for joining me for this next video tutorial. Today we're going to continue our series on shooting waterfalls and moving water. Now I'm down on this little creek. I'm not sure of the name of it, but it's absolutely beautiful. It's very prehistoric looking. There's lots of big rocks and trees overhanging the creek, and the water's beautifully clear. And what we're going to focus on today is perspective and composition. We're going to look at different scenarios and illustrate how to shoot different types of waterfalls and the moving water using a fader ND. Now, instead of stacking ND filters on top of each other, say a 2, a 4, or an 8, and combining those together, we're going to be using a fader ND, which, simply put, is just turning that ND filter so that it darkens down and we can extend our exposure to get that nice silky feel. Now, this creek is quite beautiful. It's very overcast today. It's a very subdued lighting situation, which is perfect for shooting this kind of work, because what you don't want to do is so overexpose your water through your slow exposure that it completely blows out all the detail. We're going to talk about the composition and what to put in front of the camera and what not to. So, with that said, let's get started. Many times when you're out shooting something like this on a creek or a river, there's a lot of other details that are actually around the main subject, obviously being your waterfall. But don't pass up all the other opportunities there are to shoot. You know, the other things that are actually there, all the rocks, trees hanging over the water, different configurations of how the water's circling around rocks. Look at all those details, because those details can create some really nice images also. Alright, we're set up on our main waterfall. Now this is just one waterfall. There's several waterfalls throughout this area, but I did two different images of this particular location, and I want to explain how I actually shot these so that you have a better understanding of how to control an image like this. Now, if you'll notice in the closest foreground, the big rock that's in closest up to the camera, what I did in this first photograph is I used a fader ND, and I got it pretty dark. Now, our exposure was f/22 at 25 seconds. Now, what I did is I used the fader ND and I darkened it down, and then I used a graduated ND and I flipped it upside down and used the darker portion of the graduation on that rock to knock that intensity down. So what I'm doing is controlling just a portion of that image and allowing the rest of the image to come into our main exposure. And if you'll notice in the upper left hand corner, it's a little dark, and that dark hole kind of bothers me. Now, the water that is actually coming down this creek is quite deep to my left of the image, so I can't actually step out into the water to shoot more up the creek rather than to the side of the creek. And of course I wanted some of this rock and so on to be in the shot. So your personal preference or your personal vision will determine how you actually photograph this. Obviously you could just walk up to this scene and take a snapshot, and that's not necessarily what we want to do. But now, as you're looking at this photograph, look deeper into the shot. Look at all of the other things that are within this image that you could focus in on and do other images. So when you walk up on something like this, take the required time to really look at the scene and pay attention to your composition and what your light is doing. Really, the most important thing you want to pay attention to is how that light is affecting your subject, and that will determine how you actually photograph this image. So with that said, let's move on to our next shot. We're set up on a different section of the creek, and we're actually down the creek. And as you can see, I'm kind of up on a little bit of a ridge. What I've done in my composition is I've framed up the actual main part of the creek, the part that's actually going to be blurred in the photograph. But what I've done is something a little different. I did not use a graduated ND. The lighting when I shot this was pretty good. It was subdued, so I didn't really need it. And also what I did is I used my flash. The exposure was f/22 at 4 seconds, 5 seconds, and 6 seconds, and I chose from the best image. Now, I'm doing something a little different here because I'm showing a much wider area of the scene. you don't necessarily have to focus just on a waterfall. You can create a story by showing other elements in that image, or tell a story about the location that you're shooting in. And that's what we wanted to do here, is to illustrate basically on a wider scale what this area or this environment looks like. It's very pretty, so let's move on to our next shot. Okay, we're at our next location, and as you can see, it's a cliff that's about 80 to 100 feet high. What I've done is set up my perspective so that I actually exaggerate that height and illustrate how big this actually is by using these tall trees that are in the foreground. Now, although my waterfall is my main subject, we can still see that, but we want to use these other elements to show how large this area actually is. That becomes part of your composition and part of telling the story of this particular image. Okay, we're set up on this next image, and it's a little bit different. We're actually shooting up the creek, and we're shooting along the bank, and what I'm using is all of these elements: the rocks, the grass, the limbs coming in, the waterfall itself, the fallen tree. All of that becomes part of our composition. And what we're looking at is a very narrow angle of view. We're looking right up the edge of this creek, and that's what we want to focus on. We're creating depth because we're showing stuff in the foreground of our image, and then of course we have our main subject, which is the waterfall itself. And all of this stuff leading up to the waterfall is what gives us a sense of depth and gives us a pathway, or a highway if you will, to drag us into that photograph. And that's part of your composition. My perspective is about normal height, where you're looking up the creek itself. Now what you could do is come up higher, or you could actually drop down lower. But of course, when you do that, everything that's in your foreground starts to rise. So it starts taking away from the main composition of your image. In this next shot, we're doing something pretty traditional. I'm still shooting up the creek, but I'm shooting at the main waterfall, and including obviously trees above the image, the dead tree in the water, the tree on the right hand side, and creating kind of a window, if you will, to drag the viewer into the image itself. The most important aspect of shooting something like this is, one, using an ND filter so you can slow the shutter down. Two, you want to pay attention to your color balance. Pay attention to the way the light is affecting the subject. Right now we have overcast skies. It's very soft and even. It's giving us soft shadows. Now in processing, you can go in and enhance those shadows. In other words, you can add a little contrast and lighten the areas that you need lightened. Obviously when you're working in nature, you have to be totally reliant on the light that's present. So you have to work your camera, work your exposure to capture that image the way you see it. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial on shooting waterfalls and water.